The cabin of Flight 728 was a controlled chaos. Overhead bins clunked shut. The scent of strong airport coffee mingled with the faint tang of jet fuel, and a chorus of boarding chimes played as passengers shuffled down the narrow aisle. Elena Morales, senior flight attendant, moved briskly from row to row, checking seatbelts, eyeballing carry-ons that looked suspiciously oversized, and repeating the same polite but firm instructions she'd given 1,000 times. She prided herself on efficiency. She could spot a rule breaker from 10 rows away. Halfway through her aisle sweep, her eyes landed on a man in seat 14A. He was black, mid-40s, wearing a simple navy hoodie, dark jeans, and worn sneakers. A black duffel bag sat at his feet, not under the seat in front of him. He was leaning back, scrolling casually on his phone, ignoring the bustle around him. Elena's tone was sharp before she even reached him. "Sir, that bag needs to go all the way under the seat. You're blocking the space." The man looked up, his expression calm, almost bemused. "It's fine here. I'll move it when we take off." Her brow furrowed. "No, you'll move it now. FAA regulations require—" "I'm familiar with FAA regulations," he said evenly, his voice carrying no irritation, only certainty. "I'll take care of it in a moment." Something in his calmness rubbed her the wrong way. It felt dismissive. "Sir," she said, lowering her voice but sharpening her tone, "I don't know how you're used to flying, but on my plane, rules are followed without argument." A few nearby passengers glanced up from their magazines and tablets, sensing tension. He studied her for a beat, then nodded once, not in submission but as though filing the moment away in his mind. Without a word, he slid the duffel fully under the seat. "Thank you," Elena said curtly, moving on down the aisle. She didn't see the small, knowing smile that crept across his face once she passed. Elena moved through the rest of the cabin with her usual clipped precision, but she couldn't shake the mild irritation from her interaction in row 14. Most passengers complied instantly. That was the rhythm she relied on to keep boarding smooth. But this man had taken his time, looked her right in the eye, and spoken as though he could teach her something about the rules. Once the overhead bins were latched and the aisles cleared, Elena began her safety compliance check. She had a practiced routine, a sweep for seatbacks, tray tables, electronic devices, and seatbelts. When she reached row 14 again, her eyes flicked instinctively toward 14A. The man was still leaning back, phone in hand, the screen glowing in airplane mode's absence. "Sir," she said pointedly, "your phone needs to be in airplane mode before we depart." Without looking up, he said, "It will be." "That's not good enough," she replied, her voice firm and just loud enough for passengers in the surrounding rows to hear. "It needs to be done now." He turned his head toward her slowly, meeting her gaze. "You're assuming I don't know the exact timing of when electronics must be switched over. Do you want me to quote the policy section to you?" Her jaw tightened. "No, I want you to follow my instructions." He gave the faintest shrug, tapped his phone screen twice, and held it up so she could see the little airplane icon. "Satisfied?" "Yes," she said shortly, moving on, but her pulse was ticking faster than before. The briefing. In the galley at the front of the plane, Elena poured herself a quick cup of water. Her junior colleague, Cassie, leaned in and whispered, "Everything okay back there?" "Row 14, Elena muttered, shaking her head. "Thinks he's an expert. Talks like he's above the rules." Cassie gave a small smirk. "Maybe he's just trying to get a rise out of you." "Not on my flight," Elena said, taking a long sip. "I've dealt with enough self-appointed aviation know-it-alls. They read a travel blog and suddenly think they're co-pilot." But something about the man's demeanor still nagged at her. It wasn't arrogance in the typical sense. It was quieter, steadier, almost like he had seen this before. Another test. When Elena returned to the aisle for the final pre-departure check, she saw him watching the cabin, eyes tracking the overhead panels, and the exit row procedures being explained by another crew member. His gaze wasn't casual. It was the kind of attentive scanning she associated with seasoned flight crew or inspectors. But she dismissed the thought. No inspector would be flying coach in a hoodie and sneakers, and certainly not without introducing themselves to the staff. Still, when their eyes met again, there was a flicker of something in his, as if he knew exactly what she was thinking and was letting her wonder. Elena gave him a curt nod and moved on, but the unease in her chest only deepened. The plane had been in the air for less than an hour when the captain's voice crackled through the intercom, warning of moderate turbulence ahead. Almost on cue, the first few shutters rippled through the cabin, rattling ice in plastic cups and prompting passengers to grip armrests. Elena moved quickly down the aisle, securing loose items and urging passengers to fasten their seatbelts. She was halfway back toward row 14 when the plane jolted harder, sending a coffee cup from a tray table into a passenger's lap. She steadied herself against the seatbacks, her eyes flicking instinctively toward the man in 14A. He was calm, unnervingly so, sitting with his seatbelt already fastened, his hands resting on his knees. But as she passed, he spoke just loud enough for her to hear. "You might want to recheck row 22. The overhead latch on the right side isn't fully engaged. Could drop if we hit a stronger pocket." Elena stopped, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" "The latch," he repeated evenly. "Second compartment from the back. I noticed it during boarding." Her instinct was to brush him off. She had worked hundreds of flights, and passengers pointing out issues usually didn't know what they were talking about. But something in his tone, steady, matter-of-fact, made her change course. She moved quickly toward row 22, and sure enough, the latch was slightly ajar. One push, and it clicked firmly into place. When she returned past row 14, he didn't say a word, didn't even look at her. That somehow irritated her, more than if he'd smirked. The turbulence grew rougher, the cabin lights flickering slightly with each jolt. Elena secured herself in the jump seat near the galley, but her mind wasn't on the bumps. It was on him. His eyes earlier had scanned the cabin like he was mentally ticking off a safety checklist. His warning about the latch had been spot on. And there had been that casual remark before takeoff about FAA regulations, delivered with the confidence of someone who didn't just read them, but enforce them. By the time the turbulence eased and the seatbelt sign switched off, Elena had decided something. The next time she passed his row, she was going to ask him directly why he seemed to know her job as well as she did. But as she stepped into the aisle and saw him watching her approach with that same calm, unreadable expression, she had the unsettling feeling that he already knew exactly what she was going to say and was prepared to answer in a way that would change the entire flight. When Elena finally made her way down the aisle again, the drink cart in front of her rattling gently over the carpet, she stopped at row 14 and rested her hand lightly on the back of the seat in front of him. "You seem to know a lot about this aircraft," she said in a tone that was neutral on the surface but edged with curiosity. He glanced up from the small paperback he'd been reading, his face betraying nothing. "I fly a lot," he replied simply, as though that explained everything. She poured a cup of ginger ale for the woman in 14B, but kept her gaze on him. "Flying a lot doesn't mean you know the exact row and compartment of a loose latch during boarding." For a second, there was the faintest flicker of a smile on his lips, gone almost before it formed. "Some people read novels on flights. I read the cabin." It was a strange answer, almost rehearsed. "So, what do you do?" she asked, keeping her tone casual, but leaning just slightly closer. He looked at her as if weighing how much to reveal. "Let's just say, my work involves paying attention." Her instincts sharpened at that, but before she could press further, a call button chimed from several rows ahead. She excused herself, but even as she tended to a passenger asking for an extra blanket, her thoughts kept circling back to 14A. The way he spoke was different from the usual, "I know a pilot" types. No bragging, no unnecessary details, just a quiet certainty. Later, as she passed again, he caught her eye and asked for a coffee, black. When she brought it, he accepted it with a polite nod and said, almost offhandedly, "You've been doing this a while." "Long enough," she replied. "You're good at it," he said, taking a slow sip. "But good can get better." Her brows lifted. "Better?" He shrugged, setting the cup down on his tray. "Little things, how you address passengers, the order you scan the cabin, whether you notice potential safety issues without being told. Those details matter." Something about hearing her own job described back to her, with precision from a passenger, sent a small flare of defensiveness through her. "Are you critiquing my work?" she asked, keeping her voice even. "No," he said, leaning back. Just making an observation. The kind of thing someone in my position might do automatically. She stood there for a beat longer, searching his face for any clue as to what his position meant, but his expression gave her nothing. She finally moved on, though not before making a silent promise to herself. Before this plane landed, she was going to find out exactly who he was. The cabin had settled into the quiet rhythm of cruising altitude. Low hum of the engines, soft rustle of newspapers, faint clinking of ice in plastic cups. Elena was in the galley with Cassie, restocking snacks, when a sharp metallic thud echoed from mid-cabin, followed by the sound of an overhead bin swinging open. She stepped into the aisle and saw that in row 18, a small carry-on bag had fallen, landing dangerously close to a passenger's feet. Before she could react, the man in 14A was already out of his seat, moving with the kind of purposeful speed she usually associated with trained crew. He crouched to check that the passenger hadn't been hit, then calmly lifted the bag and placed it securely back in the bin, engaging the latch with a practiced hand. Elena reached him just as he was returning to his seat. "Sir, please remain seated during the flight unless instructed." He met her eyes evenly. And if the bag had struck her ankle, or someone else's head? The bin wasn't secured properly. It should have been caught before takeoff. The words landed heavier than she expected because he was right. She should have caught it during her final checks. Still, she bristled. "That's my responsibility," she said. "Exactly," he replied softly, then sat back down and buckled in. She walked away, but the sting of the exchange followed her. She knew passengers intervening was usually a nuisance, but there had been nothing frantic or self-important in his actions. It was clinical, efficient, almost procedural. A half hour later, as she offered coffee refills, she stopped at his row again. "You noticed that bin before, didn't you?" she asked quietly. He looked up, that unreadable calm still in place. "Yes, and I was curious to see if you would." Something in her chest tightened. "Why? Why are you so interested in what I notice or don't notice?" He didn't answer right away, just studied her for a long moment, as if deciding whether she was ready for it. Finally, he said, "Because sometimes the safety of an entire cabin depends on one pair of eyes. I make it my business to see how well those eyes are doing their job." Before she could press him, the captain's voice broke in over the intercom, announcing a descent into mild weather turbulence. The cabin needed to be secured again, and the moment slipped away. But Elena's mind was racing now. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just a frequent flyer. He was watching her, testing her, and he clearly had the authority, or the knowledge, to do it. It happened just after the seatbelt sign came back on. The plane hit a sudden, jarring pocket of turbulence that sent drinks sloshing and a few overhead bins rattling ominously. Elena was halfway through securing the galley when she heard the sharp, panicked cry of a passenger from the rear. She spun around and saw a man in his 60s slumped awkwardly in his seat, clutching his chest. His wife was beside him, wide-eyed, her voice breaking as she called for help. Elena's training kicked in instantly. She grabbed the intercom to alert the crew, but before she could even cross the aisle, 14A was already moving. He covered the short distance with surprising speed for someone who had been sitting calmly moments before. By the time Elena reached them, he was kneeling beside the man, his hand on the passenger's wrist, checking his pulse with practiced precision. "I need the medical kit now," he said without looking up. His tone was firm but not frantic, the kind of voice that carried authority without needing to raise in volume. Elena handed him the kit, crouching down beside him. "Are you a doctor?" she asked quickly. "No," he replied, unzipping the bag, "but I know exactly what I'm doing." She should have hesitated, should have insisted on verifying his credentials, but something in his composure overrode protocol. She began assisting without question, relaying his requests for oxygen, for a blood pressure cuff, for the AED to be brought over just in case. He worked swiftly, talking to the passenger in a calm, steady voice, assessing his breathing, asking about medications. Within minutes, the man's breathing steadied, his color improved slightly, and he was sipping water. The whole time, 14A had been in control, directing her, instructing Cassie, even signaling another passenger to clear the aisle without raising his voice. When the situation was stable and the man was under observation, Elena stepped back, her adrenaline still high. "You've done this before," she said, more a statement than a question. He met her gaze evenly. "I've seen a lot happen at 35,000 feet. You learn to be ready for it." She studied him for a moment longer, searching for an explanation. "You're not just some guy in a hoodie. You know airline safety. You know procedure. You've been testing me this whole flight." He didn't confirm, but he didn't deny it either. Instead, he glanced at the stabilized passenger, then back at her. "The thing about this job," he said quietly, "is you never know who's watching, or why." Then he returned to his seat, leaving her standing in the aisle, a dozen unasked questions buzzing in her head, and a growing suspicion that she was about to learn exactly who he was before they landed. The landing was smooth, the kind that barely makes the wheels hum against the tarmac. Elena went through the familiar motions, announcements, thank yous, last checks, but her mind wasn't on the routine. It was on 14A. Every interaction since boarding played back in her head, from the first sharp exchange over the duffel bag to the calm, decisive way he'd handled the medical scare. Each piece felt like part of a puzzle she was just about to solve. When the seatbelt sign went off, passengers rose and shuffled toward the aisle, retrieving bags, stretching legs. Elena lingered near the front, keeping an eye on the flow, until she saw him approaching with his small duffel slung easily over his shoulder. He stopped a few feet from her, the corners of his mouth curving in the faintest smile. "You handled yourself well today," he said. She arched a brow. "Even with all the observations you made?" "Especially with them," he replied. Then, in one smooth motion, he reached into the inner pocket of his hoodie and pulled out a slim leather wallet. He flipped it open just long enough for her to read the embossed gold letters and official seal: Federal Aviation Administration, Safety Operations Division. Beneath it, his name and title: Marcus Reed, Senior In-Flight Safety Inspector. For a moment, Elena could only stare. "You're the reason I was on this flight," he finished for her. "Random, unannounced evaluation. I board as a regular passenger, observe the crew, see how procedures are followed without the filter of a formal inspection." The flush that crept into her cheeks was equal parts embarrassment and realization. "So, this whole time, you've been testing me." "I've been watching," he corrected gently. "Testing happens when I see what's needed. And today, I saw a lot, good and bad. You know your job, Elena. You care about your passengers. But you can tighten up. Pay closer attention to the details you think no one notices." She swallowed, the weight of his words settling in. "Was I passable?" His expression softened. "More than. You've got the instincts. With some refinement, you could be the one teaching others." Before she could respond, another wave of passengers pushed toward the exit. He stepped aside, letting them pass, then looked back at her one last time. "One more thing," he said. "If I were in trouble at 35,000 feet, I'd want you in the aisle." With that, he joined the line to disembark, disappearing into the jet bridge without looking back. Elena stood there for a moment longer, the sounds of the cabin fading behind her, feeling a strange mix of relief, pride, and determination. She knew her next flight would be different. Not because she'd been evaluated, but because she'd seen herself through the eyes of someone who knew exactly what to look for. And that, she realized, was the kind of turbulence she needed.